joining me. My name is Dr. Drew Mikhael. I am the lead researcher and principal investigator for the Tell Another Story research project. Apologies for if you see my eyes darting back and forward during this presentation. This is the first time I've done it through this medium. I'm going to present to you the findings from our research project that took place in Abuja, Nigeria in January of this year. We focus grouped 63 participants and we grouped them for their urban and rural locations and also on their gender and age categorizations. Those categorizations were male and female heads of household, 20s, males and females in their 20s to 30s, and then males and females in their teenage years. We also focus grouped two special focus groups which were young teenagers from an Islamic school. The central findings of the research in regards to media messaging fell in line with our other research projects in Tunisia and Lebanon. There is and as no surprise to anyone who follows the news or has followed the news the last couple of years, is that there is increasing skepticism towards traditional media. This was highly prevalent in Nigeria and Abuja as well. And what was also interesting is, like Tunisia and like Lebanon, and following on any research projects that we've seen in northern economic north or Europe, is that young people and older people across all generations are trying to triangulate their news. This is done through different means. They can try and triangulate it through other news sources, or they can try and verify or cross-check through new media, through Twitter, through different TV channels simply. In Nigeria it was no different. However, most common form of cross-checking was through word of mouth and discussion. Often young people, especially young women, would try to cross-check or verify the news that they had heard or seen or read on the internet and try and cross-check it with a male or the most senior male in their household. Males themselves would try and cross-check it with friends that they knew perhaps lived in the location that the news was emanating from if there had been an attack, or just generally discuss it with their friends. Also, other forms of triangulation included simply watching other news channels, but by far and away the most prevalent was word of mouth. Young people also agreed that radio was an important part of their communication. However, falling in line with Tunisia and Lebanon, young people also focused on social media a lot more than their older counterparts. But like Tunisia and Lebanon, they also agreed that the ethical rules of media posting were questionable on social media, and also tried to triangulate their news. Before sharing any kind of information, all participants, both old and young, would make sure that news was triangulated or cross-checked as to the best of their knowledge before sharing and posting. There is also a culture of sharing, talking and debating about posts online between men, women of all ages. Now that sharing and discussing took part online and offline. Responses to counter-radical messages and radical message were often conflated and symbiotic. Unlike in Tunisia and Lebanon, where there would be in-depth analysis of the content, the speaker, and the source and vectors of the content, both radical and counter-radical, those conversations seem to exist much less so in Nigeria. There were brief mentions of such things, but they weren't, by and large, the central premise of the conversations. What did form the central premise of the conversations was a very palatable and very important sense of defending their faith. We polled majority Sunni groups for a reason. We wanted to poll the opinions of the target audience of both the radical and counter-radical messages. In doing so, what we found was that the Sunni community that we polled was very, very keen to defend their faith, because they felt that there was a large stigmatization around their faith, much more so than in Tunisia and Lebanon. This is no doubt in part because there is currently a very, very important north-south divide between different sects in Nigeria. That is, now while it's similar to Lebanon in the fact that Lebanon has had a civil war, in which we can broadly and simply oversimplify and say that is a Christian-Muslim conflict, it's much less recent than currently going on in Nigeria. Nigeria is very much in the current throes of sect divide within their own nation, and it makes a lot of sense that those who are from a particular community would try and disengage from those they deem radical, such as Boko Haram's messages. In terms of recruitment to radical groups, the conversations that sprung up around the messages were very interesting. Much more so than in Tunisia and Lebanon was the prevalence of coercion, both hard coercion through known kidnappings and forced marriages of young women, and also the hard coercion of actually attaining land and holding it, and having children grow up through their Islamic schools, their particular branch of Islamic schools in Boko Haram areas. There was also the importance of the overall societal dimension, which meant that women in particular, even if they ended up being married, unbeknownst to them, to a Boko Haram member, there was such a stigma around the idea of divorce or leaving their husband that they felt compelled to stay. And a number of our participants expressed this problem through first-hand information of people that they knew. Young women who would end up marrying members of Boko Haram would have to stay and suffer it out because they would be rejected by their own clan, family, or village if they left. It was a very important point throughout all the focus groups was the prevalence of women throughout. There was an intense gender dynamic that was more relevant in Tunisia and Lebanon. Particularly, it seems that, as our both male and female respondents indicated, was that there is a particular area in which Boko Haram tries to exploit around women. That's both the societal pressure and also the forced coercion. In addition, other methods of recruitment fell very much in line with Tunisia and Lebanon. That is, in terms of the message content. The message content from radical messages tries to place themselves as the plug in the wall where the state has failed. They highlight the state's failure and they suggest themselves as the solution to that. This played out very well in places like Tunisia, in which there was a number of people who were suffering at the hands of state security forces. Now, in our focus groups, there was a number of participants that would flat out rejected and denied Boko Haram's narrative as false. This was interestingly due to the apparent and the perception of trust in the current president, who is seen as a good man, who is trustworthy, and trying to do everything he can to alleviate the situation of all ordinary Nigerians. Boko Haram likes to try and address those needs through their messages, and so far it hasn't really played out in any appreciable way on the ground. What is important about the messages, and this is the overall lesson that we have learned from the project, both in Tunisia and in Lebanon, is that the fact that the messages don't really matter. What matters is the government's reaction and what happens on the ground, where the rubber meets the road. Are people in an economically depressed situation? Do they have trust in the government will either oppress them, suppress them, or try to liberate them, or to try and look after their daily needs? These were the factors that much more readily sprung out from the discussion in and around the counter-radical messages. There was also, which was very, very similar to Tunis and Nigeria, which is the very important thorough line between all three cases. However, the slight difference in Nigeria was the fact that due to the ongoing insurgency in the north, that there is a more appreciable focus on security and hard security, especially as it relates to those elements of coercion that I mentioned earlier. In sum, the recommendations that we can put forward at this time for Nigeria is that, assuming, like Tunisia and Lebanon, the counter messages are going to be a panacea for the recruitment to radical groups, is a false and dangerous notion. Boko Haram uses messages as Daesh uses messages in Tunis and Lebanon as a means of propaganda and trying to win hearts and minds. However, it is not the frontal assault of their recruitment. The frontal assault of their recruitment, like Tunis and Lebanon, remains face-to-face communication and this identifying soft spots in society that they can exploit. These soft spots are realities on the ground. The exclusion and isolation, marginalization of women, the hard coercion of obtaining land, holding land, and educating young people in their perspective and their way of life, so they grow up to be young soldiers, and also the forced kidnapping and forced marriages of women. These are the central drivers of how they swell their ranks currently. Now, having said that, we all agree that leaving radical messages unanswered is not a policy that should be followed either. If you're to follow down the path of constructing counter-radical messages, they should focus on the positive aspects of government service provision, what the what the Nigerian government is currently doing to alleviate the situation, what is going on in the current fight against Boko Haram, and what are the issues that are around that. Now, a very big focus of the research was around the role of women. Women's empowerment and women's programming should be a fundamental focus within Nigeria. Now, this is a generations-long project in which we try to shift the hearts and minds and the responses to women generally across the board. But it needs to begin now, and it needs to begin in earnest. Thank you.